Good evening, everyone, and welcome to In Conversation Live. And it's great that you could all join us. I'm Gillian Leng, and I'm going to be asking most of the questions this evening, but it would be lovely if you could all join in. There's a Q&A function. I can't guarantee I'll be able to ask all your questions, but if something occurs to you, please do put it into the Q&A. So the guest this evening, as you can see on the screen, is Professor Yvonne Doyle. Welcome, Yvonne. I think you're live. I think you're on the screen. Great to see you. So as Professor Yvonne Doyle, I think you are the most senior public health doctor in the NHS. You're Medical Director for NHS Public Health. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Gillian.
And there's lots of public health issues that we can get into this evening, but let's go back at the beginning and think about you growing up in Ireland. What was that like, and what made you choose a career in medicine?
Well, Jill, actually, we're talking here in choosing a career in medicine around the early 1970s. I first realized I'd like to be a doctor when I was 14. I can't really say entirely why I realized it, but I did. And it was a combination of intellectual curiosity, but also I thought it would be a wonderful career. But I didn't really know very much about it because in Ireland, in those years, medicine was really a family business. People went in from families into medicine, as they did indeed in law. And as I found out subsequently when I was trying to get a job on a farm for a particular research project, so did farmers. Families went into the family business. So it was kind of unusual for anyone who wasn't of the blood to want to do it and why they wanted to do it. I went in 1975. It was also a time when medicine was changing in that there were more women, but actually women only constituted about a third of the class, if even that. So it was great to be there. And the first message I got from the dean, as we all did, was, well, you're the cream of the country, you're rich and thick. I thought, that's not me. I'm not one of those. I'm not any of this. So how do I fit in with the rich and thick here? And it went on from there.
And did you find any prejudice as a woman? Did you have any biases that you picked up during your time, say, as a medical student and as a junior doctor?
Well, it was the tail end of the women's movement. So there was that. I think in the 1970s, I went into med school in 1975 after having done a year actually as an executive officer in the Irish Civil Service in the Department of Fisheries. And I did that to take a year out. It wasn't really a gap year, but I also did it so that I could earn my fees, which I did pay throughout my medical career. I paid my fees for medicine because I wanted to be independent and, say I did this myself. And I did that in various ways, including tour guiding in Ireland. So I was a certificated, not certified, but certificated Irish National Tourist Guide by the time I got to be a doctor. So I tried a number of things. I didn't really find prejudice. I was just too busy actually trying to get through the whole thing and get into it. I think you begin to see some of it afterwards. You begin to think, did they really say that? Did we put up with that? And it was a different era. So people were prepared to be a bit more tolerant. But I think what I have experienced actually, as you get more senior in professions, you do sometimes come across things that you rather wouldn't have experienced. But at that point, I just got on with it.
And then why public health? Out of all the things that you can do with a medical degree, what attracted you to public health?
Well, it certainly wasn't the experience as an undergraduate, because I think like here, like everywhere, public health is something that they say it's sort of like good wine. It comes with maturity. You begin to appreciate what you are experiencing and things occur to you. And everybody I've ever met who's gone into public health, they have a couple of things in common. They share a set of values, which are, they are professional and they are medical, but they're not the same as clinical values. And they have an awareness of population. They say, I think there's something bigger than this going on out there. And I certainly felt that. I felt the environment was poorly looked after in Dublin, where I come from. And this is odd to say, but the buses were spewing out an awful lot of rubbish. And I used to ride a motorbike, Jill. Ooh. And I was right at the back of them regularly. And I thought, this is dreadful. Why is nobody looking after our environment? Such a beautiful country. So that was the first realization. And then when I was a junior doctor, I was quartered out to a rural hospital, which was a really interesting experience as a junior surgeon. And there was a series of weekends in the summertime where a huge number of people came in with very severe farm accidents. And, you know, I'm a Dubliner. I'd never seen anything like this. And I thought, what is going on here? And I started collecting information about it because I thought this can't be normal. And I wondered, was it normal? And then I found out that actually I couldn't really do that without comparing it with the neighboring hospitals to see were they experiencing these. And eventually I got onto the coroners. So I did all this as a junior doctor. I didn't know very much about public health, but it led on and I got some awards for having done it and published and so on. And somebody said, you should do public health. They get paid to do this all the time. And given I was sort of racing around, you know, on a 1 and 3 in my Mini on my days off, collecting the data, I thought this would be wonderful if I could just do this sort of stuff. And that's probably how I began to direct towards public health.
Oh, that's really interesting. So at what point did you leave Ireland and come across to England?
So the person who, unfortunately, I pulled around with me on those farm accident journeys and taking pictures of all the dangerous things we saw on tractors, eventually became my husband, Michael, and he still is my husband, I'm very pleased to say. And he ran a dental practice in a town about 30 miles outside of Dublin. And I did my public health, I got onto the public health training program in Ireland and was fully trained and realized I'd actually quite like to do more research and do some academic work. So I got a job in Charing Cross and Westminster Medical School. But at this stage, I also had a 1-year-old son, David, who's now 34. And of course, Mike was running his dental practice. So how do you do this? So you don't do this when you're as wise as we are. At this age, you do it when you're in your early 30s. I mean, I was 31 at the time. And I just wanted to do it. And Mike backed me out. We said, we'll find a way of doing it. And the only way we could do it was that I left Ireland in 1989, in February 1989, and I had got a job in Ealing Health Authority and Charing Cross and Westminster Medical School, which no longer exists. Ealing Health Authority doesn't either, but there is something there, but there's no Charing Cross Medical School. Working with Richard Farmer, who had done all the work on, a lot of work on public health and indeed on accidents and suicides. Mm-hmm. So I left and I was there on my own for 6 months, and I used to go home every weekend and see Mike and David, and then I'd leave and fly back again. We did that. I lived in a hospital flat, and eventually Mike sold his practice and joined me, and he got a job in Guy's Hospital as a dental lecturer, and he's still in Guy's Hospital as a professor, but he's never changed. I can't tell you how many different jobs I've had in those years. And David came over, of course, and we were essentially, I suppose we were not refugees, but we were migrants. Mm-hmm. So I experienced that feeling for several months.
That's really interesting and makes you really quite exceptional, because the data shows that apparently women tend not to be the ones that do big job moves. They might follow their partners, their husbands, but they don't tend to be the ones that do it. So you were quite exceptional in making that happen. I don't know what our listeners, our viewers think. Just while I'm looking at what the viewers think, there's a question about COVID, and to reassure everybody, we will get to COVID, but I didn't think we should launch into that. But I am going to move your career on a little bit, because you did a job, didn't you, as the Statutory Health Adviser for 2 mayors of London. one of whom was a certain Boris Johnson, I think. How was that experience?
Well, it was very interesting because this coincided with the setting up of Public Health England in 2013. So it commenced in March 2013, and I joined the mayor's team. I wasn't the only advisor, needless to say, that either mayor had, but the statutory bit had come from the GLA Act, where it had been written in that the mayor ought to have, or must have, in fact, because it's statutory health advisor. And so therefore, the first thing you have to do is give the person confidence that they've got a good deal here, because they don't have a choice, really. You are their advisor. And the relationship with both mayors was very good. That's the first thing I'd say. When I was in the role, and we just set up Public Health England for about 4 months, that mayor, Boris Johnson, Mayor Johnson, called a London Health Commission, because there was still a lot of controversy about hospitals in London. And I decided really that we had, I don't know, something like 100 reviews of London in 100 years. I mean, it was a lot of reviews. And this one was not going to be just about hospitals. Mm-hmm. So we brought in the health dimension into the London Health Commission. And that was very interesting. And it led to some very good things, including thinking onwards about how much more devolution did London need, but also how you engage Londoners in the idea that they are a global city, and global cities have very interesting things in common around their health. Mm. So that was and we began to get into the inequalities part of London's health at that point. And then Mayor Khan became elected in 2016, and his first term was then, and I was with him until 2019. And we took the inequalities work further forward, and it became a good focal point, really. And he was interested also in health. He was interested in pollution. His own personal agenda was on cleaning up London's air, which it still is. So it was a very good time, I thought, in London to work with the mayor, with the Greater London Authority, and with the Assembly, which was the Parliament for London.
Interesting. And was that the point when the bicycle scheme was introduced, thinking about air, the Boris bikes, was that then?
Yeah, it had happened just around the time we arrived, actually. I couldn't say we took credit for that. I think it was very much the mayor's personal agenda, and he had a personal agenda on health. He was very interested in elements of health. But the mayors differ, and I think one of the issues, and I'm sure local government colleagues know this very well, is that there are enduring elements of health through different political regimes, but there are also elements that you must go with the flow on, and where the interest is, you try and build on that and get the best out of it for the population, because that interest is actually quite precious. And if you can get benefit from that interest politically, then very good for people.
There's a question that's come in that I will ask now, so I don't leave them all till the end. It says, what advice would you give to your 18-year-old self? So cast your mind back to being in Ireland. What advice would you give to yourself at the age of 18?
Don't know what you know at 64, because you'd never do anything. These are wonderful ages, all of them. The stages of life are fantastic, and you bring different things to each stage. But one thing I think it's really important for me to kind of give as a gift is don't regret. When I did my MD, I did it on how you age well. And one thing that stops people aging well is that you regret. You say, if only I had done that at 18, or if only I'd known that at 18. I'm really glad I didn't know that at 18, actually, because I think it would have been a significant barrier. But I don't have regrets, and I'm proud of what I was at 18, and I'm proud of where it's been since.
That's a brilliant topic to do an MD on. Is there any messages for all of us here listening on how we should be aging well?
Well, that's one, is don't regret. And the other one is keep engaged. keep engaged. There's always more in life. And I think for us as professionals and, you know, as people who, I suppose most people listening here have been through a good education system of some form, whether second or third level, keep learning, because you learn so much. And I know somebody is going to talk about the pandemic at some point, but, you know, that was a profound learning experience as well as everything else. So these are good things for you to age well on.
Mm-hmm. So shall we talk about the pandemic as you mentioned it? Could you, what was your role? What role were you in during the pandemic, and how did it play out from your perspective?
Well, in 2019, I applied for and competed for the role of medical director, and that was the role I was quite keen to do as medical director. And on top of that was the role of Director of Health Protection. But I think the role was really added to it to ensure that things held together, basically, that the system worked for, you know, across the range, because some of the system was infection in health protection and some of it was hazards, which is a very different world. It's chemicals, radiation, environment, of course, as well as in there, and the sort of emergency preparedness side. So the infection service had been reorganized to be the National Infection Service. So the health protection side was really to make sure it hung together. And of course, there was the field work and the epidemiology at the local level and all that work that the health protection teams do, which of course I was familiar with London. So after 6 months, we had a shed load of things happening, including quite a serious listeria outbreak. We'd Lassa fever, repatriations, we'd monkeypox, the beginning of monkeypox, I would have thought possibly, and a lot of other sort of stuff going on. And I was looking forward to 2020 enormously. And got the call on New Year's Eve from our on-call people to say, we think there's something odd going on and there's somebody going through our borders here and they've come from this area where it looks like there could be some pneumonias. And, you know, what do we do about that? And I thought this could be, we need to really, really watch this very carefully. And I've been sort of reading it in the journalists' readouts about stuff that was going on in China, but I don't think it was really in people's huge awareness in December. Anyway, my role, to answer your question, was that I was the medical director during the whole period from then until 2021, when Public Health England finally disbanded into three main parts. And in the first 6 months, I really had to take quite a lot of the reins in just holding things together as to how we just responded to the very best of our ability, which we did. And then during that very interesting period, let's say from about July of 2020 to October of 2021, really holding things together with some very good colleagues, while we ran, in a sense, a parallel world of the science in Public Health England and the operational response in test and trace. But all the while, you know, eyes on trying to hold that system together so that we handed over a good system in good order as best as possible.
And it was a really interesting time, wasn't it? Because we'd had a number of sort of small outbreaks or things that were contained like Ebola, and suddenly there was this completely unexpected massive pandemic. So to pick up some questions from the Q&A, Judith Farley asks, why was COVID-19 never made notifiable like other communicable diseases? I think it is now, isn't it? Has it been?
Yes, it is. I mean, initially there was a huge amount unknown, and the apart from notifiable, which you know came, the initial press really was to ensure we knew a lot more about it, and it very quickly became a high consequence infectious disease. And then it was stood down from that. But in the first instance, that was you know where we had to be. And I don't think people appreciate how, you know, how much we had to learn. People now think this was all known. It really was not known. And it was an extremely scary place to be for everyone.
Yeah, it was because some of the people watching might or might not know that my husband was doing the job that you took on at that point. So there was a bit of overlap, and I kind of lived some of it secondhand. So there's a question here from John Rudd. He asks, with hindsight, would you agree that a regional / local system of management would have worked better than centralized control for the COVID pandemic?
Well, this is a good question, because it's something I have looked at many times. I, by nature, am place-based. I mean, I was a director of public health in between that time of being a sort of researcher and hopping into the Mayor's Statutory Adviser and so on. Part of my roles in between those years was as a director of public health in Southwest London in 3 boroughs. And I loved it. It probably was the more or less nearly the best job I ever had, and very place. Of course, you have to be place-based. And as a regional director, very aware of place. And in that place is the full train set in some form or another of what the public health service offers. And that would include health protection, and still does. So what does the national bring? The national brings the things that should be done nationally. And, your science has to be, you can't have 42 or 7 or 20, or you name the number, different versions of what is a scientific truth. You need to make sure that people get that done once by people who have expertise. And we've been having the discussion recently again about prevention services. What is the purpose of a national programmatic approach versus just, a kind of take it as you find it and then implement what you need to do locally. You need to complement them. They are not mutually exclusive. And I looked, Gillian, at I've looked at several times at the international setup for health protection in various Western countries and, developed world. And we always ask that question: what is going on locally? What are your connections locally? Who controls the local system? What is it, what does the national bring to local? And pretty well everybody acknowledges you need a national and a local system. The only debate really is who's in charge of which element, or whether it's all one part of one service. Yeah. And we could talk about that all night. We've actually written it up for publication at the moment, a little team of us, because it's a really important question.
Yeah, no, that's a interesting answer, and we'll look forward to that publication. But we certainly saw, didn't we, in the pandemic, a lot of work across the devolved administrations as well. The CMOs worked together because of that very need to bring national thinking in alignment. I've got a question here for you. This is an interesting one from Roger Kirby, who is, of course, the president of the RSM. He asks, in retrospect, which political calls were right and which were wrong with regard to the management of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, if we're talking politics here, I mean, there are so many different elements to the politics of what has happened that it's a question I couldn't possibly answer. And you'll know, President, that actually Lady Hallett has employed over 70 barristers just to get to the root of what actually did happen. And I say that I'm not trying to ignore the question. It's a very interesting question. I don't think it's one for me to answer. I have views, as personal views. But what I would say is this. One of the issues that came out very strongly, and we do need to learn from it, is how decisions are made and where they are made, and particularly where they're documented. And this is the case in every investigation that happens. Is, how did this come to this point? Who made that decision? Why? What was your role? And so on. And that is, I suspect, what some of the 70 barristers will be trying to get to as well. And it isn't that this, people were not trying to record what they were doing, but the pace of some of this was just exceptional. I mean, people were working 16-hour days with very little time to look at anything other than respond. But I would say the big learning always in these events, and hopefully we will never have a pandemic in my lifetime again, but we might, is to have make sure you have systems in place, and we had as best we could, that do record well and do make the record of your decisions. I think if you're asking about across the whole system, you would have to actually understand fully how and where decisions were made. And then I think you might be in a better position to answer about the politics.
It's a good answer. And I'm also trained in public health, although I haven't been an active practitioner, as it were. And the outbreaks I've been involved in have tended to lead to a learning phase afterwards, which means next time you see what you've just had, you'd be great at it. So if we had another pandemic with a coronavirus, we'd be great at it. But of course, the chances are we won't. It'll be something new and unexpected. So how do we plan for the unexpected rather than what we've just had?
Well, it's again, great question. I mean, bearing in mind, we've actually lived through 2 pandemics. I mean, the first one was in 2009. As practitioners, I mean, we've lived through other epidemics, you know, when we were children as well. I mean, I was alive when the Hong Kong flu hit. But, you know, the 2009 was different. And in fairness to people who handled that, they were criticized, as I remember it. I wasn't hugely involved in it. I was a director of public health around that time. But, you know, they were criticized for getting it wrong on overkill, you know, to overcall things. And you can overcall, undercall. It's a really difficult set of decisions. And I suspect in any future crisis, many people will end up having to make decisions in the moment. So how do you prepare to avoid that? Well, I think international learning is much deeper this time possibly than it has been, and that is one of the gifts of the pandemic. And there are benefits from this pandemic, as well as tremendous sadness and loss. But there are some things that we have actually got for future populations and the current population going forward. So good practice, learning internationally how things were prepared for. So I went to South Korea in 2016, and it was quite interesting. I was there for a very different reason. It was a research reason. And at that time, they had just had their MERS experience, and they were bothered about this. And I think they had learned, and I think we can learn in this way to prepare ourselves, you know, about how we would practice an actual pandemic, having now lived through it, and everybody pretty well has. That will be helpful, I think. But undoubtedly, you know, the next one will have different, you know, infection characteristics. So we have to be resilient in the moment as well.
There's a couple more COVID questions, Yvonne, and then we'll move on to something else. So Deborah Lapthorne, she asks, if you could change one thing about the pandemic response in the UK, what would it be?
I don't know that I would change one thing. I think we'd have to change. I mean, this would be, in fact, a bit arrogant of me to say there is one thing I would like very much to change. I reflect very much on, you know, the role I played. Would I have wished not to be there, for instance, is the obvious question. Would I have rather been in the back room? And the answer is no. Despite everything it took out of me and my family, I really am proud that I was there. So I think the learning will come from the impact it has had on patients, populations, and our staff, our colleagues, our systems, and where we would have changed for the better in those circumstances. But personally, I'm proud I was able to be part of it and did my best.
And a question from Gillian Perry-Keane. What were your personal feelings when the PM and a lot of the cabinet were diagnosed with COVID simultaneously?
Well, I can answer this one because we used to have Zoom calls like this with various members of the cabinet. And of course, when I was doing Downing Street briefings, I met many of them. And I was concerned, very concerned, actually, Gillian, as you would be for any citizen, that, you know, people were experiencing something, the outcome of which we weren't clear at the time. And, you know, this is another unknown, is how would this affect individuals and why? So yes, I was concerned, very, as I would have been for any patient or member of the population that I encountered.
And final infectious disease question moves us from COVID into monkeypox. It's from Dr. Addy. I don't know if it's I don't know if it's he or she. Dr. Addy says, from what we learned during the COVID-19 pandemic and from infection control measures, how should monkeypox be contained now?
Well, I think, again, this comes back to the issue that every infection, every hazard has different characteristics. So we did have experience of monkeypox in 2019. It was incredibly intense dealing with it at the time because it was one case and was high consequence infection and was treated as such. We now understand a lot more about the dynamics of monkeypox. I think people are very honed, Dr. Addy, at the moment, particularly on health protection. Given a few years' time, that may relax a little bit more, but people are at the top of their game. They may be tired, but they're at the top of their game, and they're very vigilant and very aware of, you know, the risks, but in the context of that particular infection. It's not necessarily they're treated the same as COVID. And but this certain basics are there, you know, understand good surveillance, understand your population, message correctly, ensure your contact tracing is sensitive to the population that you're dealing with, and that, you know, you can implement successful measures for them and for those around them. Those principles are enduring. It's just that people are very, very tuned to it just at the moment.
Right, I told you, I said we'd move on. I said we'd move on. So I want to talk about social media, because of course it did play a role in the pandemic in good ways and less good ways. So first of all, are you a social media user? LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter? Right.
So I'm not on Facebook. I'm glad I'm not. I may be a bit of a Luddite, but I just amn't. And this is actually something about your personality and your values. I just don't particularly really mind if people like me or not. And I do have a circle of friends. Yes, I am on Twitter. I do feel guilty about this, by the way. I spend a lot of time on tweets because what I want to do there is not just say what I think. Nobody cares what I think, but to convey some good information, but it does take time. So I will wait until I see something that might be of interest, particularly in public health, but perhaps elsewhere. Stay well away from commentariat stuff. There's plenty of that. So that's Twitter, but it doesn't happen that often. And I am on LinkedIn. I have been for years. I started it and therefore I'll finish it. And I see it as a mechanism for maybe helping some people who are up and coming in their careers to link into my network so that they get some advantage.
And there's some increasing evidence, isn't there, that social media can be harmful to young people. It puts significant pressure on people's views of their body image, perhaps, for example. So should we be doing more to protect young people? Should we be doing more to think about how social media are used to communicate health messages? What do you think?
Well, social media is a force for good and a force for downside. It has in equal measure, I would say, almost. If you're at the receiving end, it doesn't feel like that. But I think it has been tremendously useful in the pandemic to network people, particularly actually Twitter. However, I do see the impact, particularly on young women. And here's one I probably would dwell on a bit. In that young women in their teenage years, and I experienced this personally as well, it's a very difficult time for women, for young women, girls. They do care a lot more than perhaps men do about, and boys do, about what people think of them. And they are very influenced by all this, and they don't realize some of the lies. And therefore, when despicable things happen in any sphere in social media, I think it needs to be treated in the way that journalism is treated. There should be consequences. If you're publishing something, there should be a consequence to what you are overseeing. You're not just a kind of conveyor, you are actually Twitter or Facebook or whatever. And I don't think the rules are the same. Now, I'm not really well qualified to get into the legal side of this, and I wouldn't wish to. But I do think that the ground rules are not the same for social media as they are for other forms of media. And it can harm, and it's very difficult, I think, to sometimes get redress for that harm. And it may be very difficult for the companies themselves to control that. I don't know. But, the idea that you can just say anything you like and there are no consequences can bring out the worst behaviors in humanity. That would be my personal view. I'm sure it's not what everybody would think here. But I also accept that it has been a force for tremendous use and networking.
Yeah, I had a chat, only a brief one, with the chief executive of Facebook. Of course, they've got these plans for the metaverse, and he said he would welcome more regulation, but didn't give any examples of what that should be. And I must admit, I'm not very good at virtual worlds. But perhaps that's something to experiment. Perhaps that's part of this aging well, Yvonne. You and I, we need to get out there with an avatar and be in the
yeah. No, and the aging. I mean, I've just been looking at Emma Thompson's movie, which I'm not advertising it here. I'm just saying I enjoyed it, and there is something beautiful about aging, which I think we're a bit reticent about, perhaps in this part of the world. I think in other parts of the world, it's respected and perhaps admired more.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Addy's asked if you are on doctors.net.uk, a forum. And I'm certainly not, but I'll have a look at it afterwards.
No, I'm not, Dr. Addy. I knew of it, and I think I might have been at one point briefly, but I'm not. And partly, I suppose, as I'm a bit lazy, I should engage with some of this at least. But, as I say, I am quite careful about what I want to put out there. And I think I would prefer it had benefit rather than just my opinions.
Well, before the virtual doors were opened, we were talking about the Met and policing in London, weren't we? And violent crime is a particular challenge, I would say, in London. And some people say it needs to have a public health response. So I'm going to ask you what that should be. What should the Met or indeed the public health colleagues be doing to sort out violent crime?
Yeah, and it's actually a really good public health question. And the example I will give is London. I know good colleagues in London are also in this space. So when I was there, we were in touch, and the Mayor Khan was very worried about this, and the police commissioner, the police advisor to the mayor was also likewise. And we worked together to see how, with the NHS, we could formulate a program for both the staff, but also for the victims of violent crime. We're particularly worried about stabbing in London, but in other cities, it is other types of crime. Every kind of problem will come through A&E. So the A&E consultants in some of the London hospitals were particularly active on this. We still are. So some of my team are working on violence reduction, particularly through A&E, but looking at how we can work with community groups, first and foremost, to get a consistent approach to protect and train staff, whether they're police or nursing or A&E consultants, whoever it is that encounters the violence, that they understand how to address this and how to, where to refer. I think some of the programs wanted to reach further out using respected clinical voices to try and work with communities, and particularly with families who are experiencing regular crime. So it's a very big that's the individual approach. I mean, the population approach is to try and understand the root causes of where some of this is coming from. What is driving it? Is it drugs? Is it criminality? Just general criminality? Is it the sex trade? What is it that's driving this violence? And gang violence is a very particular subset of that. And working with young people has had great benefits and good outcomes. The problem is the stop-start nature of the programs, and every time systems change, you know, the people who are involved with this move on. So it's not easy, but local government, our colleagues, directors of public health, have also been active in the space. So I think it is a very important public health matter. I think it's important to work in good partnership with the police, with others, community workers, the mental health system, of course, as well. I work as a non-executive on a hospital trust, and it is probably one of the hottest issues I know the hospitals have to deal with in the cities.
And linked with violent crime is often drug use, drug misuse. And I heard a statistic last week that in the UK we're spending £9.4 billion a year on illicit drugs, which is more than the UK revenue of Aldi, Boots or EasyJet, apparently. So any thoughts on how we should reduce the use of drugs, how we should handle all the, you know, the county lines? Are you pro legalizing drugs with regulation?
It's a very difficult question to answer, because I think you can see the benefits of legalizing drugs. You know, the criminality apparently reduces, but I think we need pretty good evidence in the context of particularly and it is often a city issue. It's not entirely, as you say, county lines is where the cities kind of reach out into the coastline, and the CMO's report on coastal towns and their deprivation it's very relevant there as well. And some surprising places that you wouldn't expect to have problems. So places where people congregate engender the criminality, and drugs are often part of a much wider spectrum of criminality, Gillian. So I think just going for a slogan like legalize drugs may not actually solve the root causes, which, you know, undoubtedly come right down to the inequalities agenda that we're trying to address systematically. I think, and here I would say, you know, drugs are a particularly perverse part of those inequalities that we experience, but they're tied up with other things, with you know, trafficking, with domestic violence, and at the root cause of much of this is poverty. So poverty, deprivation, very difficult topics to address at scale. But the only way we can make progress on this is to work in good partnership. And trying to do this singularly through, say, the NHS or through a single organization in a place, it just doesn't work that way at all.
One extreme of the deprivation spectrum is homelessness. And there's a question here from Stan Burridge. I think you might know Yvonne. He says, Yvonne has been more than supportive in the work I've previously done around involving lived experience of homelessness. What advice could she offer to move the conversation away from the trauma / poverty porn approach to involvement, often re-traumatizing people and profiting on misery, and into a more equal partnership between lived and learnt experience, which can influence real sustainable change in the public health agenda on homelessness? So we want to move the conversation away from trauma to involvement.
Well, hello, Stan. First of all, it's great to hear you. And I don't think I can better your answer, so I'm not going to try and do that. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you were one of the leading lights, and in fact inspirational to us. And I was describing just how you have done this recently to a colleague, you know, where you actually are yourself a role model for those who feel they could make it as well out into something where they can help others. And that's what you're doing all the time. And that has been done, I know, through very hard effort and experience on your part. And I would hope through the help of the people in London who've worked with you. And so the issue you're raising here is how important it is for the experts not to be too expert, because they don't really know what it is like. And they often come up with the wrong answers, and they just talk over the heads of the people to whom it matters. And every community, activist and worker has had that experience from the experts. So I think a bit of humility on all our part would be good. We need to find the funding and the opportunities to make sure that we don't do any events or indeed implementation of anything, design or whatever, without the engagement of those who actually are ready and willing to give that experience in and get the solutions right. But it's enduringly hard work. And that is the problem. You're there and you've been there for a long time. And I know others who have been wonderful colleagues, have been there for the long run. And what you don't want is people who are just coming in to kind of, pull a stroke or give it a wheeze and then move on. And that is hard. It's very hard to get people who want to stay with things for long periods of time. And that's what this needs. And public health is like that. It can have great success in short periods of time, but you take your foot off the pedal and it regresses. So you need to keep with it. And that is the long-term agenda.
Yeah, that's a really important message. In relation to housing, not homelessness, but housing, am I right in remembering you were involved in the Grenfell Tower fire, or at least the fallout of that?
Yeah.
Yes,
that was 2017. And I remember I was with some colleagues on the night it happened, came home and turned on the television only to see this going on. And I think I went with some of my London team at the time down to the streets around where it happened within the week. And people were actually sitting in chairs on the streets, having meetings on the street. It was an extraordinary early experience. And having worked with that group of people, but particularly with the people who worked with them, because who am I? I mean, I was the London director, but they didn't know me, and they needed people who they could trust, and that was a very big issue at the time. But I was involved with that for a good year or more, and it was extraordinarily difficult to listen to and to experience and to realize what had happened there. And, these are experiences that you just have to be humble about. I mean, I could talk a lot about it, but the fact is that it is, it was unresolved at that point and is still being worked through. So that shows you what long-term means.
You went, I think, to some town hall meetings, didn't you? Those must have been quite challenging.
They were very challenging, and rightly so. And this was part of the lifelong learning in public health. Is, I've been on many platforms in my career on hospital mergers and change of services, and you think you've seen it all, when you've done things like that. You haven't. What really, really hurts communities is when something like this happens, and you are in the heat of it, and you're doing your best, and you're trying to think, what is it that we can do here that is helpful at this point? We know what needs to be done ultimately, and you're dealing with very distressed people, but people who would come up afterwards and talk to you, and it was not a feeling of being an expert at all, I can tell you that. But it was just important to be there. Whatever came out of it your way on that evening, you had to be there to show that, you were willing to be there. And that doesn't sound very sort of professional, but that was the important thing to do.
And I'm sure it was really valued by the local people that you had made that effort to go along. Well, we're working through lots of public health issues. Here's another question from Roger Kirby. Does Yvonne have any thoughts about the ways and means of dealing with the obesity crisis here and overseas?
Here and overseas, I'd like no pressure then, Roger, solve the world, yeah. So I remember a GP saying to me when I was a director of public health, now it's going back 20 years, he said, we're living in a sea of food, Yvonne. How are we going to deal with this? And you know, when we were sort of young, I'd say, you know, but when we were teenagers and young adults, it was kind of unusual to see people who were overweight. And in a generation, everyone, including for me, the saddest thing, young people are, you know, clearly overweight and struggling sometimes to just get past that. And, you know, I've had some personal experience of that with people I know. Mm. So what is the answer to this? Well, we did actually start working very hard on this when I was regional director for London. And this is one of the great advantages to being a place director, is we did decide that actually what really mattered here was to stop the next group of children getting into that sort of situation where by year 6, 2/3 of them nearly were overweight. It may not have worried many, you know, some of them, but it was a worry, and it was a worry because of their future health. And we started a multifaceted, very interesting set of programs, which were place-based, very connected with local government, quite connected with business, with the City of London, with other places. We did the Great Weight Debate, which was incredible, and engaged parents and engaged activists. And eventually, through the London Health Commission, worked with the parts of the food industry. All very, very challenging, I would say. Needed complex adaptive work, not short-term work, needed to be kept going because this is hard work. And food is not the same as tobacco. You know, food is much, much more complicated than tobacco, which is much more complicated than immunization. So what I'm seeing is we're ratcheting up the complexity of what we're having to deal with over years. And we need the very, very best people in public health to deal with this.
And Stan Burridge again, he says one of the problems is that one apple and one banana will cost about the same as an unhealthy microwave meal.
Yes, and therefore, why are we not all into the apples and the bananas? Because I think people have become addicted to the taste of particular foods. And food is addictive. It's not just addictive in terms of your behavior. The taste of it is you smell something and you want it. And it's desperately difficult. The other thing we found, Stan, was that the youngsters and the teenagers were going to certain places to eat, not because they were particularly hungry, but because it was a social kind of expression of where they could meet. And, you know, the stuff was cheap enough to be able to afford it and feel a little bit independent on the way home from school. So the whole social behavioral, social epidemiology came into this as well. It wasn't just about food. So, you know, we need people who challenge us, ask the questions, give us the evidence as you've just done. We need people who understand why behavior is the way it is and how we can actually address some of that, whoever we are. Because, you know, the default is all, oh, well, it's all the family, but, you know, families need help. I know my family, we all need help.
So in your current role as medical director for NHS Public Health, which I think is a new role, isn't it? You're the first person that's ever been that. How much of all of these public health issues are you going to be able to sort out, Yvonne? That's a strange way of asking. What are your responsibilities in your role?
Well, you described me as the most senior public health doctor in the NHS. I'm sure a lot of people might feel they were the most senior public doctor of some kind in the NHS. So I'm not going to claim myself as that. But what I went back to do, Gillian, was to actually rebuild the public health service in the NHS, because I think it is an important service. It's important for disease prevention. It's important for you know, the way that the NHS can help through its partnerships address risk, but also can address, you know, deprivation inequalities as well through the patients that they see. So we found that actually the NHS had lost its public health professional function entirely, and rebuilding that and building capacity, bringing on people for the future, will mean that the NHS is making its good contribution to the public's health in the round. It needs to work through place in partnership. And the programs that I'm encountering through very, very good colleagues who are dealing with prevention, yeah, we have obesity, we have a tobacco program with alcohol, with violence reduction, all of that. We've got excellent regional programs, again, some of it implementing and dealing with this. We've got the screening, immunization, and then out in the place-based, the 42 integrated care systems, we're now just reawakening their awareness of what good might look like in that system for a good public health offer, so that they deal with the totality and not just the data handling, but the whole, the whole gambit of good public health in place, and take their opportunities, which come with the assets of the place, to address some of these very difficult challenges that we've just mentioned. So the NHS is up for it. There's good inequalities work through a terrific and a charismatic leader on the inequalities side. So I think the NHS is looking for that leadership. What it definitely will want to do is make sure it's all coherent and we work well together.
Sounds really exciting, a great opportunity. And have you got a big team, Yvonne, or is it more about partnership working and using other resources outside the organisation?
So Gillian, I've had it every which way. I've had huge teams and I've had tiny teams, and I've been a single-handed practitioner, and it really, whatever it lands in my lap, I will make the opportunity to, to promote and press on with the public health agenda.
We're almost out of time. I can't see any outstanding questions. So what about a sort of question to think about wrapping up on, which is, how do you encourage junior doctors to go into a career in public health? Give them three reasons to choose a career in public health.
It's exciting. No 2 days are the same. It means it's a value-driven, meaningful place to be. You will not be bored. And you're doing things that really do make a difference, despite all the waffle about, oh, it takes 20 years to get things done. It doesn't, not at all. You can see great results very quickly. The training is excellent. It's really, really good. And there are some inspirational people there who care about what they're doing and will be in it for the long run. They're not running away. They have stood up in a pandemic. They've been brave. And that shows what public health really is.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. As a junior in public health, I remember once worrying that I hadn't learned all the answers to the challenges that were being presented. You know how we, as doctors, we learn lots of stuff, don't we? But you do have the opportunity in public health to really think, to really use your own common sense, to analyse and to deal with challenges that nobody else might have ever faced before. So a lovely comment from Dr. Addy saying it's been an honour to hear your responses, Yvonne. I won't read it all out, but it's a great comment. Roger Kirby's asking about alcohol intake, but I don't know if we've got time to do alcohol intake. Do you want to end on that, or shall we wind up? Any thoughts about excessive alcohol intake, says Roger.
Try not to do it. It gives you a terrible hangover. It's not very good for your liver, Roger, as you know. And Gillian, could I just thank you and pay tribute to you as an equally super leader, and to Paul, who we all miss terribly, but was a wonderful colleague.
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne. It's been really lovely talking to you, and I hope everyone else has enjoyed it too. So I'm going to wind up there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I can't wind up. Sorry. I need to remind everyone, this is my first time I've done this. I need to do the housekeeping and say, please do join Simon Wesley, who will be interviewing Nick Robinson on Wednesday, the 6th of July. That's the prompt. It's just come up on the screen. So it should be a fascinating interview. And I will really say good night now. Thank you.